Hey, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. 10 a.m. on Sunday, June 21st. Happy Father's Day.
Thank you.
Happy Father's Day to any of you who are out there, fathers, or have had a father. If you are here with us, let me try to get this. If you are here with us, let us know you're here.
Yeah.
I'd love to know who's here.
And maybe a thumbs up from somebody if our speaker or our microphone is working correctly. I think it is. I got a new wire for it, so I think it's good.
You're getting Father's Day greetings.
Oh, thanks. You too. Fathers.
I really like watching this more than the Bible study. I like the social aspect of people.
It's been a little hard this quarantine, this stay-at-home time for extroverts like Clover. I'm loving it. But...
They're quarantining. I'm like, look at all these people. Look at all these people here. Mm-hmm. Yay, people from Cleveland, people from Denver. Anyway, so let us know you're here. That's great. So welcome back to Book of Revelation. I
just said thanks. Sounds good.
Yeah. For our second session on the Book of Revelation and Apocalypticism. Nothing says summer like Revelation.
And Father's Day like
Father's Day like Revelation and Apocalypse. Yeah, and some plagues. Just want to let you know we have the Bible. Tim has a bagel, I have a fresh blueberry muffin from Vivian Showalter, who left us blueberry muffins on the our porch this morning, which was like so nice. I love it so much. And coffee. And us. And the Bible.
Props.
All right. We know that some people get on a little bit later. Not that we want to slow down the beginning, but anyway, I don't, Yeah. We'll pat her here for a minute. So this is what we're going to do this morning. We're going to do a very brief overview of the Book of Revelation, a little bit of what we said last week. And when I mean we, it really is Tim, because he's the biblical scholar in this setup. And so I'm glad that you're doing the biblical scholarship on this book. So we will go through the outline and overview of this book, and we'll get into a few different sections of the Book of Revelation itself. We'll do the beginning with the letters to the seven churches, and then we'll do chapter 4, the description of the throne room of God, and then we'll move to chapter 21, 22 at the New Jerusalem, the city of God. I think that's the outline for this morning. We hope that you were able to read into the text itself so that you have an idea of how crazy it is and how compelling it is. So, yeah. All right.
Yeah. I think that's about it. It's crazy and compelling at the same time, which is part of what draws us into it. So wanted to just kind of do a quick overview of the content, just a quick kind of outline so that you know where you are when we look at these three different passages together and talk about them. An outline is a little deceiving because it sounds almost simple when you look at it in outline form, and then when you start to read this text, it gets really overwhelming and confusing quickly, but at least it gives some sort of a shape and a sense of where one is. So we'll do that first before we dive in. So basically, and also I think I included the first part of my introduction in Revelation, a biography, the book that is mostly where I get my backwards. Yeah, but right. Yes. But it's a pretty, anyway, it's a beautiful artwork on the cover. I really love it.
Very much.
At any rate, in there I give a kind of summary. I don't remember how long it is, but a little bit longer summary, just kind of quickly moving through the whole thing. But in terms of like an outline, you've first got, in the first chapter, you have what we read last week, John introducing himself and what this is and where he is while he's writing it. We don't know who this John is, as we discussed last week. And then there is this first revelation of Christ to John. And it's very overwhelming. You should read it. It's that second half of chapter 1. It's a great example of the way you can describe something, write an image in a way that you cannot depict. When you read that image, you really can't draw it. It has too many features. They don't fit together into a single image. But at any rate, that's the first encounter John has with Christ, and John falls on his face as though dead. And then Christ kind of props him back up, and then you move into the next.
It's understandable that he'd fall dead.
Right, breathe, John. And then you go straight into chapters 2 and 3, which are letters from Christ, from the risen Christ, to these 7 churches. And that's that's the first text we'll look at. Jesus addresses each of the churches in a kind of brief epistle, and basically says some good things usually about them, and then some critical things about them. And so those are the letters to the 7 churches. Those 7 churches are all, if you look at a map of even a modern world map and just look at Turkey, they're all on the west side, close to the coast. Some are on the coast of Turkey. So those are, and then Patmos is an island off of that west coast. So it's all kind of in that region. Anyway, you have those 7 letters to the 7 churches, and then it goes straight from there. John gets taken up into heaven and has this vision of the throne room of God. It includes all kinds of elders and interesting creatures. We're going to read the first chapter of that, chapters 4 and 5, to look at that text. It also has an image then of Christ as a lamb that has been slaughtered but is standing. Another unusual image of Christ in that text, for sure. And then from there, after the throne room images, you go straight into a long section, really chapters 6 to 18, which is all of the tribulations and plagues and all of that kind of stuff, all the way up to the declaration that Babylon has fallen. Babylon being, in the book of Revelation, the name really for the Roman Empire in its early context. And those are that section, chapters 6 to 18, is structured as a series of 3 sets of 7. And so this is about all the structure you get, really, in some ways, in that long section. But you've first got the 7 seals on the scroll, and each seal is opened and something happens. And at the 7th seal, it brings forth the 7 trumpets, and each angel blows one of these trumpets, and something happens, usually all kinds of destruction on the world, or on living things, or the water, or the mountains. And then at the 7th trumpet, you have the inauguration of the 7 bowls of wrath. And each angel pours out one of these bowls of wrath, and something happens. And that's what I love about the cover. It's also in the ad for the Facebook page, but this is a painting by Spencer called The Angels of the Apocalypse, and you can see they look like they're flying around gardening, like watering plants or something, but in fact they're pouring out bowls of wrath on the world. These nice sort of friendly grandma looking gardening angels with wings pouring out bowls of wrath. Isn't that nice?
Gardeners are complicated.
It's great. Yeah, it's a complicated image. Anyway, so that's the main section, and that ends then with the fall of Babylon, the fall of Rome. And then you go from there into chapters 19 and 20, which are about the second coming of Christ, and then Christ reigns with these martyrs who have suffered for him and died for him for 1,000 years. And then at the end of that 1,000 years, all of the dead are resurrected and judged, and the bad ones go to the lake of fire, there is no heaven and hell really in this story, at least the way we think of them. And the others are resurrected and given new, fresh, perfect bodies. And that's when the new heaven and new earth and new Jerusalem happen. And it culminates with the city of Jerusalem coming down from the heavens, and a sort of reestablishment or recreation happening there at the end. That's in chapter 21. And then chapter 22 is kind of final wrap up from John, some warnings about no one should add or take away from this text, and or they'll get all these curses that have been described in the text and that sort of thing, and wait because the time is near. So that's the book of Revelation as a whole. Any thoughts about that as just a kind of your favorite parts?
Well, the chapter 21 is my favorite part. I'm drawn to the images of the city of God and the New Jerusalem and the river going down the middle, and there are some, but I think so much of the language throughout the book is just familiar. Like we'll just have an image or a phrase that I think has made its way into church vernacular, right. And you're like, oh, that's where that comes from. Yeah,
that's true. That is partly what I think has made this this text kind of have a life through history, is the way these images, like the New Jerusalem for you, breaks free from the text as a whole and takes on a life of its own and becomes compelling and gets traction in other kinds of media, in art and in music and in other kinds of creative work. I think that's right.
Yeah, and it strikes me that, I mean, most texts do that, right? They're bits of text and fragments that get taken out of context, I guess, but taken out, and people attach to certain phrases or images theologically, or in the life of the church, I guess, and that's what we attach more weight. So it didn't seem like Revelation is different than other parts of the canon.
No, that happens in with all kinds of pieces of Bible that kind of break free and circulate in all kinds of interesting ways. I think partly because the book of Revelation, these different visions really stand alone. Like the throne room kind of stands by itself, the red dragon stands by itself, the New Jerusalem stands. They easily detach and take off. And then the other thing about that is, we might talk about this later, but they're really so incomprehensible. They're really so hard to understand, to make sense of. They're rich with symbolism that's completely lost on us. We'll talk about that. And like I said before, they're descriptions that are hard to depict in an image. So that incomprehensibility is part of what gives these little story image combinations life, I think. Right.
And I think in staying power. Yeah. Right? Because people are always still trying to understand, what does this mean? And then it's always getting recontextualized for our own lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were thinking that we would look at a few texts today, and so we'll try to keep to about 10 or 15 minutes for each one, and move along through them like that. And we thought we would jump in first on the 7 letters to the 7 churches, which comes right there after that first revelation of Christ in chapters 2 and 3. And we'll just read them straight through together and then talk about them. A couple things to remember, that the book of Revelation really isn't just a coherent narrative, right? It really is a series of visions, and the 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls kind of hold it all together. It's full of symbols that are kind of lost on us. It culminates in this final battle, but you can keep that outline in mind as a kind of context for what we're looking at, but we really just sort of have to jump in someplace and start reading and kind of read it on its own. So we've already talked about where those 7 churches are, right? So
I'm looking for a bigger Bible.
Oh, I'm probably not.
This one is
that's
very...
our daughter's cabinet.
There's very
hopefully
tiny.
brought it with her.
Yeah. No, we know that's not true.
We'll do our best.
There might be one up there.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Okay.
This one's too tiny. Oh, look at that.
Okay. So again,
Maybe
that's
we'll-
NIV. I don't think we want that.
Oh, that's not going to help either.
Yeah, we're going to stick with that little one. I think
Okay.
we have to.
You don't
Or I can go find another while you read. How about
Well, that's
that?
the problem, though.
Okay.
The problem is reading. This is very tiny, and it's very dim in here. So we'll see.
Okay. Don't know what to do.
To read from here. Okay. So what do you want me to read? What exactly?
Chapters 2 and 3.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to try to find a Bible. While you do
Okay.
that.
There's one in our room. Okay, so I'm going to try to read here in this very tiny print. Read along at home if you have one. Okay. Sorry, we didn't plan on this tiny Bible. Okay. To the angel of the church in Ephesus, write. These are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in the right hand, who works. Oh, this is really going to be works among the 7 golden. Here. I'm not doing this one. That's funny. Have a Bible that actually is readable. Okay, we'll try this. It's just my contact lens. It's actually not the Bible. They're fuzzy. Okay. Ay.
Do you want me to read it?
Okay, you might need to. I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance. I know that you cannot tolerate evildoers. You have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them to be false. I also know that you are enduring patiently and heading up for the sake of my name, bearing up, and that you have not grown weary. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Remember when you came... Oh, God. Remember then from what you have fallen. Repent and do the works you did at first. If not, I will come to you and remove your lamppost from its place unless you repent. Yet this is to your credit. You hate the works of the Nicolaitans,
yeah.
Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. That sounds familiar. We say that every Sunday. To everyone who conquers, I will give permission to eat from the tree of life, that is the paradise of God. We can't read this much. That is a ton.
But we have to, because otherwise we can't. So we can just look at a couple of them. So
I think so.
Let's look at. So we got the bit about the Nicolaitans in the church at Ephesus, and so another is the message to the church at Pergamum. We've actually been to Pergamum and Ephesus
and Smyrna.
In fact, we'd love to lead another trip sometime
to Turkey,
Western Turkey, to visit some of these. Pergamum is an incredible ancient city, ruins now, but there's a city nearby. You can either hike up or you take a gondola or something up to the top, and it's just ancient ruins all the way along the hillside going up to that. At the very top, there's this huge amphitheater, for one thing. There are lots of other incredible buildings, and there is this giant temple that is right on the top at the highest place on Pergamum. And many think that what is being referred to as Satan's throne, that sounds like the church lady, in this letter to the church at Pergamum might be that high place, that high temple. So I will read that. To the angel in the church of Pergamum write, these are the words of him who has the sharp two-edged sword. I know where you are living, where Satan's throne is. Yet you are holding fast to my name, and you did not deny your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you, where Satan lives. But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the people of Israel, so that they would eat food sacrificed to idols and practice fornication. So you also have some who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Doesn't like those Nicolaitans. Repent then. If not, I will come to you soon and make war against them with the sword of my mouth. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. To everyone who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give a white stone, and a white stone, and on the white stone is written a new name that no one knows except the one who receives it. So now I'm going to skip ahead to the letter to Laodicea, and then we'll talk about these. And to the angel of the church of Laodicea write the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the origin of God's creation. I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were either cold or hot. So, because you are lukewarm and neither cold or hot, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing. You do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. Therefore I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire, so that you may be rich, and white robes to clothe you, and to keep the shame of your nakedness from being seen, and salve to anoint your eyes, so that you may see. I reprove and discipline those whom I love. Be earnest, therefore, and repent. Listen, I am standing at the door, knocking. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in to you and eat with you, and you with me. To the one who conquers, I will give a place with me on my throne, just as I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. So those are a few examples of those letters. There are other ones in there. There are 7, obviously, altogether. But you got a sense of some of the things that John's Jesus wants to emphasize in these teachings. What's being praised. Any thoughts about?
Well, I find that the most interesting to me is that each letter, or I'm not sure every single letter, but most of them, it's Jesus saying, I know this about you, and they're really positive. You know, you have struggled, you have cared for the poor, you've been generous, you've withstood, temptation, and then I have these things against you. It's almost what we fear the most is
but I will say
that here's something that I have recognized, and you're like, oh, come on, I know we're complicated, but don't hold those things against you. But it says I have this against you, and I think every church struggles with those things. So that's one thing. I'm interested by the comment, the line, I reprove those I love. So it's almost like, is that a framework for this, all the judgment in this book? It's like, well, how does that play with this love, kind of the sword and the love that Jesus holds, or this judgment holds in it? I think that's interesting.
Yeah, it is. Another value in this part of the book of Revelation it is that it offers a window into the history of what we call early Christianity, although that was not a term in that early context. Scholars will often talk about it as the Jesus movement, or even the Jesus movements, plural, because one of the things that we realize, thanks to having the book of Revelation and the letters of James and a couple other texts, Peter, Hebrews, and then the what appears to be the argument that Paul is having with Peter and James, who were original disciples who are leading the church based in Jerusalem. You recognize that there are differences among these different communities in the Jesus movement, that it is a diverse movement. We could talk about it as early Christianities in plural. There's a great book about this. Pam Eisenbaum wrote a book called Paul Was Not a Christian, meant to be a provocative title, but part of what she's saying is there was no uniform, univocal, homogeneous Christianity there in the time of Paul, or for a century after that. There was no single Christianity. And so one of the tensions that we really can see when we look at this text and think about Paul, when we look at Paul in Galatians talking about Peter and James, has to do with this question about observance and practice. Faith versus works is how it kind of plays out in contemporary language. But clearly, James and Peter in Jerusalem are maintaining a Jewish observance of the law and purity regulations and so forth that Paul is telling new converts they don't have to do, even circumcision, and let alone eating kosher and those kinds of things. And with John of Patmos here in the book of Revelation, we have another window onto that. He's in the thick of this controversy, and it might not be obvious just from reading these letters, but just think for a minute about the things that he emphasizes. How does he begin each of the letters? I know your works. It's not I know your faith, it's I know your works. I know what you do. Remember James, faith without works is dead, right? Just as the body without breath or spirit is dead. Faith without works is dead, and James 2 is more oriented toward practice, toward observance. And here you've got, I know your works. You've got this language. We didn't hear it in any of the letters that we read, but he he criticizes those who say they are Jews but are not. And he's one who says he's a Jew. And he wants the Jesus movement to be observant in that way and to self-identify.
James.
No, John of Patmos. He says they say they're Jews but they're not. And we'll see what that means in a minute, but part of how he unpacks that is he says these people eat food that has been sacrificed to idols. Right. That's unacceptable. That's unclean, right? They eat food that's sacrificed to idols. They practice sexual practices that soil their clothes or make them impure, he says at one point. So they say they're Jews but are not. It means they're not as good as they say they are from John's point of view, right?
In their actions.
In their actions, and that's all that matters. I mean, that's what matters for John. There is no faith that isn't observant of these practices. Now, if you go and look at, we don't need to go and pull it up, but take that and then go and look at some of Paul's letters, right? For like 1 Corinthians 8, Paul says, look, we know that these other idols, they're not really gods, so we don't have to worry about that. In verse 8 of 1 Corinthians 8, Paul says, it doesn't matter if you eat of food sacrificed to idols because those idols aren't real anyway. And just don't make it a stumbling block for other early followers of Jesus who might see that as a problem, right? Well, I mean, Paul is who John of Patmos in Revelation is talking about. He's the one who's advocating eating food sacrificed to idols, which is the main sin that John's Jesus is preaching against in these letters, is reprimanding followers of Jesus for. And then you look at Galatians 2, where Paul is talking about his back and forth with Peter and an argument about eating kosher foods and that sort of thing, and observing these rites. And Paul argues that that's not what matters, and argues in Galatians that what really matters is faith, not works. So, Paul is the enemy in the book of Revelation. He's and John of Patmos might be the weaker brother who stumbles over these observant things in Paul's writings.
Interesting.
So that's part of what you see there that we wouldn't have if we didn't have this text, is the diversity of Christianity, but also the tensions between, a particular kind of tension between someone like John and someone like Paul.
When I was at Forest Hill Church, my colleague John Lentz and I did a Kerygma series, but we preached on Galatians and James. And they were the conversation, right, of faith. So same kind of conversation that James has.
And it's just, it's interesting once you throw Revelation in there, because James and Paul, they can just sound like a disagreement. Yeah, well, one emphasizes faith more, one emphasizes works more. You know, John of Patmos is like, you're out. You're you know, spawn of Satan.
He's a little more colorful about it.
He's a little
more
judgy.
A little judgy. A little descriptively judgy.
Yeah,
he doesn't make Jesus look so kind.
And in that phrase that's in there, they say they are Jews,
look, our
but are
daughter's
not.
watching.
Oh, hey, so.
Hi, tell your dad.
Hey, Brennan, great job this morning.
Tell your dad
Professor
Happy
Seattle.
Father's Day.
She already did. She texted me.
Oh, that's
anyway,
nice.
We're not going to bring her on the camera. Sorry, Soph. We don't know where you are. Anyway, that phrase that John in these letters says, they say they are Jews but are not. John's having Jesus say that. In John's context, in that ancient context, clearly was saying they're not observant. They're not, a follower of Jesus needs to also be, truly observant,
fully
Jewish as well. And later on in Christian history, though, that phrase got turned around by I forget who it was, but who argued that what that meant was those are the Jews who didn't follow Jesus. Not those are the Jews who were observant. And so that became a condemnation on the Jews for rejecting Christ, which feeds into the history of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism as it relates to this text. Very different, a way of distancing John of Patmos in the book of Revelation from the Judaism that it was really identifying strongly with, which is
that one of the reasons you think Luther so didn't like this text? His alignment with Pauline strong grace? I mean, kind of anti-Judaism?
Certainly. He didn't like Hebrews, didn't like James.
Right.
And this text. For sure. That's definitely part of it. He talked about them in the language of Galatians as Judaizers. So was definitely on the Pauline side of faith and grace, right?
Right.
So that's a little bit on that one. Let's look at the next text, and I suppose I should try to read it since I think you're not
doing great with this. Sorry.
See it. So that's Revelation 4.
The throne room.
So this is right after those 7 letters. John gets taken up, and we will just dive straight into the image. And I want you, actually, if you have a notepad in front of you, just try to draw, or imagine yourself trying to draw what is being described. Try to depict what's being described here. I think it's pretty close to impossible. Part of the reason we wanted to look at this particular text, though, is also that a lot of its language is really prevalent in hymns, in images of heaven, in hymns.
Oh, absolutely.
And even some of the really kind of scary ones.
Here.
Right. Holy, holy, holy. And
think about it.
Right.
You can just hear it echoing in your ears when you read this chapter 4.
Right. Exactly. So I'm just going to read it. It's much shorter. It's kind of overwhelming. Try to imagine all of this stuff, all of this sound, all of these images, all of this movement going on essentially forever in this kind of infinite iteration, I guess, is what's being imagined here. Anyway, so the letter ends to Laodicea, what we just read, and then you get this, a very common, familiar phrase from John. After this I looked, and there in heaven a door stood open. And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and there in heaven stood a throne, with one seated on the throne. And the one seated there looks like jasper and carnelian, and around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. Around the throne are 24 thrones, And seated on the thrones are 24 elders, dressed in white robes, with golden crowns on their heads. Coming from the throne are flashes of lightning, and rumblings and peals of thunder. And in front of the throne burn 7 flaming torches, which are the 7 spirits of God. And in front of the throne there is something like a sea of glass, like crystal. Around the throne and on each side of the throne are 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with a face like a human face, and the fourth living creature like a flying eagle. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and inside. Day and night, without ceasing, they sing, Holy, 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 the Lord, the God Almighty, who was and is to come. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to the one who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall before the one who is seated on the throne and worship the one who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne, singing, You are worthy, O our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. So you've got this incredibly rich image. You realize there is someone actually sitting on the throne at the end when the elders tribute it. All you have before that is all of this stuff shooting out from the throne in the middle of it. And you have these creatures with eyes on the insides and the outsides, whatever that means, with 6 wings. And they sing without ceasing this holy, holy, holy. And every time they do it, all of those elders throw their crowns on before the one and sing this song. So it is just, it's quite a busy scene. Yeah. And that's all I have to say about that.
I love it. I don't know. It's magnificent, and I don't know the connection between Isaiah in the throne room and how this seraphim or
right, and
flies
Ezekiel
around
too, these creatures.
Yeah, and he
winged
creatures, and he's, or is it Jeremiah that has the coal on his mouth? Anyways, Isaiah, yeah. So it just depicts that same kind of overwhelming throne room, and that all of this energy, these 24 elders, these living creatures. I'm curious, also more curious about the writer of the hymn, Holy, Holy, Holy. And even that, I think it's interesting that is one of the favorite hymns of the church. And there's something, people are moved by it. And so there's something that it really captures our imagination deep down. Like that's, you feel compelled to sing out that kind of magnificence.
And don't you think part of what gives you that feeling of overwhelming awe that I think that song also tries to give expression to or evoke is the overwhelmingness of the image. It's just piling up image and action and sound on top of image and action and sound. And even John, in describing it, he's not saying, and then there was this lake that was made out of crystal. He says there's this lake that looks like crystal or looks like glass, or John 2 is using similes. It looks like this. There was this that looks like this. It almost is like John is overwhelmed and doesn't have language to translate.
It's all metaphor,
right?
Yeah, it's all metaphor and simile, right? They cast their crowns before upon the glassy sea.
Upon the glassy sea. Yeah, that's right there in the
it's all there.
Yep.
But I had the same when you were reading it. I had this memory. I know this sounds kind of weird, but going to like the Taylor Swift concert or Pink concert, but everything is so big and grand and theatrical, and these creatures that are made, and the Taylor Swift concert, these large serpents that she had come out of the. I mean, if you were trying to describe that to others, it sounds it just sounds kind of ridiculous, and yet the power of that whole experience that you were caught up in. Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great point of comparison, because this is a kind of staged scene, right? There's the 24 and the middle throne, and then there are the creatures, and there is a kind of, you know, call and response going on. I imagine it almost like a stage, and so it's almost like a staging of a stage, because then where is John? Where is his point of view in relation to this whole scene, which kind of reminds me of what you're describing.
Yes, you heard it here. Taylor Swift concert and chapter 4 Revelation. Sophie will love that.
I was thinking more Gwar myself, but anyway.
Anyway,
look it up.
Theatrical, big theater is what this reminds me of.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's a good way to think about a lot of the scenes like this, especially maybe the ones where there is someone enthroned, that it's often kind of built out in that way, which is interesting too, insofar as that the ancient Roman context of Pergamum and Ephesus had these incredible amphitheaters, these incredible theatrical spaces. Absolutely. So there might be more to that. I bet there are scholars who have written about that and looked into that. Interesting. Good. So, and one of the things we'll talk about too next week, we'll look at some examples of these texts finding their way into other kinds of creative works. We talked about the hymns today, but we'll look at, for example, one of I'll share some images, but James Hampton, who was this artist, nobody knew he was an artist while he was alive, but he had rented out a garage and for many years, more than a decade, had been building this throne room of heaven for the coming millennium, to sort of welcome and enthrone
turn of the
Christ.
Century? When was that?
It was in the late second half of the 20th century.
Second half.
So the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Okay. And it's now in the Smithsonian, in the American Museum of American Art. Anyway, it's one of the Smithsonian's, one of the American ones. But it's very much a stage too. And then Hildegard of Bingen, who drew and described these kinds of scenes, was also a musical composer and a visual artist, and so again you get some of that sense, and we'll look at a couple of those.
Oh, I can imagine the thousands and thousands of inspired pieces of art, music, visual, over the centuries from this. Yeah.
So another one, Clover's favorite.
My favorite.
We'll do last, which is on chapter 21. And just to give a little context of that, because we're jumping way ahead through all the tribulations and all the 3 sevens and of trumpets and bowls and seals, and you've already had the second coming of Christ, who has ruled with the elders for 1,000 years, and then after that. And before that, the final battle of the 144,000 against the nations, and the devil is defeated. The red dragon, who is the devil, is defeated along with his beasts and thrown into the lake of fire. And then you have this really interesting scene that has fascinated people for as long as this text has been read, of the resurrection of all of the dead who've ever died. And they're resurrected, brought back to life on earth, and they're all judged. Are they in the book of life or are they not? And the ones who are not get thrown into the lake of fire too, and the others get new bodies, perfect, rejuvenated bodies. And St. Augustine and a lot of others have been really fascinated with this sort of logistical questions related to that. Like, for example, how could you have checked all of those names from those millions of people over time in the book of life? And he says, well, there were all these angels who had copies of the books, and so they were able to do it that way. And then, like, how does resurrection happen? Like, what if you were eaten by a tiger, or what if you died at sea and you kind of decomposed there? How does and if you died when you were a baby, do you come back as a full-grown adult? If you died really old, do you come back?
I think people still struggle with those questions.
Do you get all of the fingernails and hair that you had in life?
Have those conversations.
If you're bald and all of these, he asks all of those. Do you get a full head of hair? What about martyrs who have wounds that they're proud of because they suffered for the sake of Christ, and they get to keep theirs because those are signs of badges of honor, but the other kinds of wounds are restored. Even talks about cannibals, like what if somebody ate another person and that person's body became part of their nutritional value, and it all has to kind of get conservation of mass, kind of has to get restored back to those original bodies. Yeah,
that's a lot of detail.
Pretty wild. Yeah, well, it was because there were others who were arguing against Christianity, saying this is a stupid idea. There's no logistical way this could have happened. So Augustine had to sort of, well, yeah, it could, and this is how.
Oh wow!
To kind of work it all out.
Well, see, that still happens with people who are apologists,
right?
Yep.
And we still have in the our confessionals, we believe in the resurrection of the body.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of Christians probably take that to mean the resurrection of Christ or something like that. Or maybe they, that Christ was resurrection. Or maybe they think it means not resurrection from the dead, but going to heaven or something like that. Mm-hmm. But resurrection of the body there comes from this notion that all of the dead would be resurrected. It's a little more complicated 2,000 years later than maybe it was, in the first century or so.
Yeah. Shirley Guthrie has a good chapter on the resurrection of the body in his Christian Doctrine book. It's interesting.
Oh,
yeah.
Good.
If for those of you who went to Columbia Seminary and have read Christian Doctrine, there's a good, he goes through the creeds and unpacks them a bit. And it's
kind of a redo of, or an update of Karl Barth's little Dogmatics and Outline.
That's right.
Interesting. Good thing to read. Okay, one more text. So that's all. They're all resurrected. Some got sent to the lake of fire. Others got fresh new bodies, and now it's this sort of perfect, redeemed, restored world. And then this is the new heaven and the new earth, the new skies, if you will, and new earth that come in chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne, saying, See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them, and they will be his peoples. And God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away. And the one who was seated on the throne said, See, I am making all things new. Also he said, Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true. Then he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. Those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But as for the cowardly and faithless, I always got to go back to those, the polluted and the murderers, the fornicators, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all liars, their place will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. Then one of the 7 angels, who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues, came and said to me, back in those 3 sevens, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And in the Spirit he carried me away to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. So another angle. It has the glory of God and the radiance like a very rare jewel, like jasper, clear as crystal. It has a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and on the gates are inscribed the names of the 12 tribes of the Israelites. And the east 3 gates, on the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And all the wall of the city has 12 foundations, and on them are the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The angel who talked to me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies 4 square, its length the same as its width, and he measured the city with his rod 1,500 miles. Its length and width and its height are equal. He also measured its wall 144 cubits by human measurement, which the angel was using. He helped us out by not using some angelic metrics that we don't know. The wall is built of jasper, while the city is pure gold, clear as glass. The foundations of the wall of the city are adorned with every jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. And the 12 gates are 12 pearls. Each of the gates is a single pearl. That's a big pearl. And the street of the city is pure gold, transparent as glass. I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and God is its light, and its lamp is the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. Its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. People will bring into it glory and the glory and the honor of the nations, but nothing unclean will enter it, nor anyone who practices abomination or falsehood, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. So that's it. Still got a big keep out sign for the
It strikes me though that magnificence, the overwhelming beauty. I just was thinking, if you were an oppressed people who lived, I saw some photos of the early 30s and the Dust Bowl in the United States and the Dust Bowl here in Colorado, and these images that are so bleak, stark, just monotone, dirt that these poor farmers had to live in and try to create crop. But if you heard that reading, if you were an oppressed people and you heard that description of that as the city of God, it's the hope or the the afterlife would become what you would focus on, because your life here is unbearable.
Right. And that could be otherworldly hope. I mean, that expression, those pearly gates, obviously comes from this, and that's a notion of.
Hey, there you go.
That's a notion
I never knew that.
Of heaven as the doors of heaven as pearly gates. Even though this is not heaven, this is this worldly renewal of this world. It's not some otherworldly place you go when you die, but the pearly gates. But then, like you were talking about the Dust Bowl, and I was thinking about those great images in John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, where as they're going out to California and dreaming of what it's going to be like, it's a this worldly bounty. It's I'm going to crush these grapes and they're just going to pour down my face, and it's just going to be almost like waste. There's so much richness and excessiveness to it, which again, there's the this worldly dream of that, and then there's also that otherworldly hope. I think for many who are in suffering, which Marx talks about too, right?
Right. Well, and don't you think those get conflated? I think that's the issue, is that the New Jerusalem gets the city of God coming here gets conflated with a sense of the afterlife, and our images are combined. Yeah. Wow. I don't know. I want to go to a place where there's no mourning or crying or.
Do you think you get boring after a while?
No. Tired of this.
There's a Talking Heads song that says, "Heaven is a place where nothing ever happens."
No, that does not sound like that. That is not described where people are just sitting around bored. In fact, again, Shirley Guthrie has a great description of the city of God, and that it isn't a boring place that's been made monotone or whatever, that there's a richness of the people who are there from all the nations, and you know that I don't know, there's a diversity and a complexity to this place that is God's vision.
Yeah. And I think where we are in our own lives and our own experiences are, you know, says a lot about what we imagine as an alternative to that. And if we are just weary and broken down and impoverished and, you know, unable to rest, we are so pursued, to use that kind of language from the book of Job. Great job this morning, Brennan, on that discussion. Then imagining it forever and ever is not hard to do, and it's attractive and appealing to us. I think when we're in that restlessness, the notion of a kind of endless rest or endless, you know, goodness or something like that is real and attractive in a different way.
Absolutely. Yep.
We just have a couple minutes left.
And should we, if there are questions, do you want to take questions? We
can try. We only have a couple minutes, so there's not really much time. Marilyn brought up about the 4 threes of the gates, which again represent the 12 apostles, sure, but the 12 apostles disciples represent the 12 tribes of Israel. There's a lot of numerology in this. The 144,000 is 12 times 12, right, as well. 3s and 4s are big in this, which 3 times 4 is 12. There's Jewish numerology in this text. There's also Pythagorean mathematic numerology. If you look up Pythagoras' triangle, you'll see what I'm talking about. We don't have time to get into that too much. You also have a lot of 3.5s. If you think of 7 as being completion and perfection and totality, you know, Shabbat means 7. It's the completion of the week, and all of that. Then 3.5 means incompletion, something that happens for an incomplete, broken amount of time, and an imperfect kind of time. You know, just all kinds of ways these numbers interact with one another, and 12s are huge in this, and 7s are huge, obviously, in this as well. And then 7 is 3 plus 4, 3 times 4 is 12. So there's all kinds of ways that the numerology plays out too. And there's a lot of other symbolism. We just have no idea what it's referring to. We just can speculate about it. We don't know in that letter that we read at the beginning who Balaam is supposed to be, or Balak, or who even the Nicolaitans are exactly.
Really?
Later on, they were believed to be followers of Nicholas, who was mentioned in Acts 6 as one of the appointed leaders, but we don't know that. And
Did
could
he
be
lead
some
people
other
astray?
lots of Nicholases around.
Oh,
yeah, well, nothing in Acts about that, but and same with, there's a reference to Jezebel in one of the letters, which obviously, you know, is a denigrating term insofar as Jezebel in Kings is Ahab's wife, who kind of entertains and hosts not just the prophets of Yahweh, the Israelite prophets, but also the prophets of Baal and Asherah, and so Elijah doesn't like her. There's a big battle between Jezebel and Elijah.
Well, there's a lot in this text, as you've said, that's very misogynistic.
Yes.
That's pretty dramatically misogynistic, and
that's right.
Hard to know what to do with that, how to sit with that as the text. Yes. We don't have anyways, it's difficult reading. It is. And you can see why the lectionary committee for preaching very much cherry-picked which text throughout this Revelation. Absolutely. The few times that we even have Revelation in the lectionary. Very intentional about it. So next week, so during the week, will you post
I'll try to post
pieces?
some pictures. I'll maybe stick them on a Google Drive or something so that you can go and look at them that way, because some of them are copyright protected, or that we had to pay or get permission to use them in the book. But I can find a way to share those as links. Feel free to share them with other people. We haven't quite decided what all we want to focus on. I think for sure, though, I want to look at James Hampton's Throne Room. It's such a fascinating story, and just incredibly creative and really overwhelming in interesting ways. We might also look at Hildegard of Bingen and some of her work, or we'll think about what would be good. I'll include a little bit from each of the chapters in my book about those, whatever we decide to focus on, so that you have a little bit of context. I can't share the whole thing for copyright reasons, but I can share a few pages of each one and give you some context, and we'll dive in and kind of look at the afterlives of this text. We have been looking at that all the way along, but we'll do more of that.
It keeps on living, given our context, right? It's,
for better and worse.
It keeps revealing itself, I think, for us.
Yes. All right. I think we are over time. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you.
Thank you,
for
Clover.
starting your hat for your Father's Day.
Oh, yeah.
Here. Thanks, daughter, for joining.
Yeah, thanks for joining, Soph.
Thanks, all of you. And we hope you have a really nice Father's Day, whatever you end up doing this day. And we hope to see you
one more time next week.
Next Sunday, 10 o'clock. All right.
All right.
Peace be with you.